If a murder, a shooting, or a major disaster could shake public trust, the Soviet press often had one instinct first: keep it quiet, delay it, or turn it into something smaller. That is why this story matters. To understand Soviet crime, you have to look not only at what people were told, but at what they were prevented from seeing in the first place. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. The reason so many Soviet crimes never reached the newspapers begins with how Soviet information worked. The Bolsheviks shut down hostile newspapers early and subjected publications to preventive censorship, and by 1922 they had created Glavlit, the Central Censorship Office, with final authority over printed materials and the performing arts. In other words, the Soviet press was never designed to function as an independent watchdog. It was designed to serve the state, protect the state, and shape what reality looked like in public. That meant a newspaper editor was not simply asking, "Is this true?" The more important question was often, "Is this politically safe to print?" A Cambridge history of Soviet journalism notes that accidents, natural disasters, and serious crimes were especially sensitive for the authorities, so reporting on them was often very limited or absent altogether. That tells you something essential. Silence was not just carelessness. It was policy. If a crime threatened the image of order, safety, competence, or ideological certainty, it was exactly the kind of thing likely to be reduced, delayed, or removed. There was also an ideological problem. In the Soviet system, crime was not merely a legal fact. It could also be a political embarrassment. A study in the British Journal of Criminology notes that after the collapse of communism, statistics on previously taboo phenomena such as homicide became available in the Soviet Union for the first time in more than 50 years. That is a remarkable fact on its own. If even homicide statistics could be treated as taboo, then the logic behind suppressing individual cases becomes much easier to understand. The state was not only managing fear, it was defending a worldview. This helps explain why some of the most serious Soviet events were kept out of newspapers for years. One of the clearest examples is the Novocherkassk massacre of 1962. Workers in the city protested worsening economic conditions, and the crowd was dispersed by gunfire. According to the Soviet History Archive, 24 people were killed, dozens were wounded, and more than 100 people were later convicted, with 7 sentenced to death. But the same source states that the authorities did their best to cover up what happened. That information leaked back into the country through Radio Liberty, and that the first article about the event, published by a Soviet newspaper, did not appear until June 1988. That is not normal reporting delay. That is a quarter-century of suppression. The reason is easy to see. Novocherkassk was not just a crime story. It was politically explosive. A state that claimed to rule in the name of workers had opened fire on workers. If such a case appeared honestly in the Soviet press, it would not merely raise questions about local order. It would raise questions about the moral legitimacy of the system itself. So the press did not openly confront the event. It was pushed into silence, and the public was left to reconstruct reality through rumor, private memory, and unofficial channels. Another example is the Kishtim disaster of 1957, near the secret nuclear complex, later known as Mayak. Britannica states that buried nuclear waste exploded, contaminating about 23,000 square kilometers, forcing the evacuation of more than 10,000 people and probably causing hundreds of deaths. But the same Britannica entry says the Soviet government refused to acknowledge that the event had occurred until 1989. This is not a conventional murder case, but it shows the same mechanism with unusual clarity. When death, danger, and state responsibility came together, the newspaper was not automatically a warning system. It could become an instrument of concealment instead. That same logic shaped criminal investigations too. A powerful example is Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica notes that his case is noteworthy not only because he murdered at least 50 people between 1978 and 1990, but because Soviet police efforts to issue warnings to the public were hampered by official ideology. which asserted that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. Britannica also states that he targeted young victims at rail stations and bus depots, and that investigators became aware a serial killer was active in the region. In other words, the problem was not total ignorance. The problem was that the public could not be warned clearly and honestly as early as it should have been. That matters because newspapers do more than report facts. They tell people what kind of danger exists around them. If the press cannot name the danger, the public is left with uncertainty instead of understanding. In Chikatilo's case, disappearances and fear spread through families, transport routes, and local communities while public information lagged behind. The silence did not reduce panic. It made panic less precise. People knew something was wrong, but they were given less clear language, less official warning, and less public truth than they needed. Once you understand that, another part of Soviet life becomes easier to understand: why unofficial information mattered so much. Britannica's entry on Samizdat says that its major genres included reports of dissident activities and other news suppressed by official media, transcripts of political trials, and social and cultural analysis. That means Soviet citizens themselves understood that the legal press was not telling the whole story. If important truths had to move through carbon copies, hand-to-hand circulation, and underground reading networks, then absence from the newspaper was not proof that something had not happened. Often, it suggested the opposite. This created a strange and corrosive psychological environment. In an open media system, a serious crime at least produces a public record. In the Soviet system, silence itself became meaningful. People learned to read omission as a sign. If a major disturbance did not appear in print, it might mean the case was politically sensitive, institutionally embarrassing, or ideologically dangerous. The official newspaper did not just shape what people knew. It shaped how they interpreted not knowing. That is one reason Soviet fear could feel so heavy. It often grew in the space between what people sensed and what the press refused to confirm. It is also important to say that not every unreported crime was hidden for the same reason. Some were suppressed because they revealed state violence. Some because they exposed major accidents. Some because they contradicted ideological claims about socialist order. And some because local or central officials feared scandal. But the result was often similar. The public received a narrowed reality. Serious crime looked rarer, less structured, or less socially revealing than it really was. This did not make society safer. It made public understanding weaker. That is why this subject matters beyond censorship history. It shows how a state can influence not only what people say, but how they perceive danger itself. If newspapers omit patterns of violence, delay reporting on mass tragedy, or refuse to name a threat honestly, then citizens do not simply become uninformed. They become dependent on rumor, whispers, foreign broadcasts, and fragmentary private knowledge. And once that happens, trust begins to collapse in two directions at once. People trust the press less, and they trust the world around them less too. In the end, so many Soviet crimes never reached the newspapers because Soviet newspapers were never meant to expose reality at any cost. They were meant to manage it. Protecting the image of the state often mattered more than documenting the full truth of a killing, a shooting, a disappearance, or a disaster. That is why absence was so important in Soviet life. What the public did not read was often not empty space. It was a sign that truth had collided with power, and power had won, at least for a while. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.